Chapter 4. The Matron of Nettlefield Grange. The sight of the orphanage matron's heavily made-up face in Mr. Rogers' window made Ida freeze in panic. Mr. Rogers wiped his oily hands on a rag on the bench. Catching his glance, Ida slid off the driver's seat. The backs of her legs stung where they peeled off the leather. Her face felt red-hot. She was trespassing. Perhaps she should come clean, but that would get Mr. Rogers into trouble, and she certainly didn't want that. The brake, clutch, and accelerator pedals poked into her side, but she curled up as best she could on the floor of the car. She hid her face in her arms and hoped with all her fingers and toes crossed that because a nearly 14-year-old girl was the last thing anyone would expect to find on the floor of an Austin Ruby, they wouldn't. Ida heard the garage door judder open, and Mrs. Buller, matron of Nettlefield Grange and owner of the Ruby, marched in. "Rogers, how long is it going to be? You've had it for hours." Ida peeped out from under her arm. Through the passenger window, she could see a black beret, bright red pouty lips, and a tight jacket pulled round an ample bosom. "Well, I've done what I can with the fan belt," said Mr. Rogers, "but you've completely worn out the bearings. I'll have to send for some new ones, and if you want the belt to last, a new one of them and all." "Do what you have to do," ordered Mrs. Buller. "It will take a while to get the parts, to do a proper job. You can have it back later this afternoon, but I'll need it again, say, a week on Monday." "You'll have it done well before a week on Monday if you want any payment at all." "It will take a fortnight to get the parts." You can have it until tomorrow, and I'll want it back by 6 p.m. "That's near on impossible. I can't do that." "Your petrol is very cheap. Not selling agricultural fuel legally by any chance?" She wagged her finger at him knowingly. "And the 2 pumps outside, how frequently are they checked? I'm wondering if I should ask my friend at the council to arrange an inspection. With all those mouths to feed, you wouldn't want your business closed, would you?" Mr. Rogers sighed. "Right, I'll do what I can. Bring it in tomorrow, then." He combed his fingers through his hair. Even from behind, Ida could see he was flustered. The handle on the inside of the driver's door moved. Ida heard the latch click open. Her skin tingled all over. Was Mrs. Buller actually getting in? She curled up tighter, but it was hopeless. They were both going to be in trouble now, her and Mr. Rogers. But the car door clicked shut again, as if Mrs. Buller had changed her mind. "I'll be here to pick it up tomorrow at 6 o'clock sharp." As the garage door shut and Mrs. Buller's shoes clipped-clopped across the forecourt, Ida uncurled and breathed out a little whoosh of air. She never, ever wanted to come face to face with the matron of the orphanage. She wriggled out of the footwell, but as she did, her cardie caught on something. She pulled, and a piece of panel under the dashboard came away and clattered to the floor. With it came a wad of paper and a pale pink paying-in book from the bank. With trembling fingers, Ida gathered up the book and the papers and stuffed them back into the hole made by the missing panel. Though she was putting back and not taking out, she still felt like a thief. It was hard putting the panel back with shaky hands, but as she tried to slot it in place, she saw that her cardie had caught on the latch, which held it there. Was this really another way to get into the engine? Mr. Rogers looked in through the driver's window. "She's the right one. You all right, love?" Sure that her face was bright red, Ida could only say, "Yes." She felt very wobbly. "Don't know how I'm going to get the parts by tomorrow. I'll have to go now," said Mr. Rogers, shaking his head. The garage doors rattled again, which made Ida's heart leap. But it was Alf's head peering through the window. "Aspirin for Barnes?" His breath steamed up the only clean patch. "I've got to go, Mr. Rogers. Mum will be expecting me back." That's right, you get going, Ida, love. Give your mum my best and watch that young lad. It won't be long before he's asking to walk out with you. He winked and pushed the garage door open for her. Where had Mr. Rogers got an idea like that? She'd been enemies with Alf since they were infants. Don't forget this. Mr. Rogers gave her mum's little purse, empty now, but it was special to her. Margate was where she and Dad had had their honeymoon after the war. Outside there was an autumn nip in the air, but at least it wasn't raining. Ida knew Alf had probably seen her sitting in the Austin. So what? He was getting a tugboat at Southampton docks, the gateway to the world, they said. Trying not to catch his eye, she snatched the bottle. It rattled with tablets this time, and leaving the jealous boy behind, Ida ran round the corner into West Street past the new travel agency with exotic posters of ships in the window, and past Uncle Arthur's shop. She waited for a traction engine to trundle by. The smell of soot filled her nostrils and made her eyes water. As she wiped the tears away, she saw Mrs. Buller leading a line of orphans out of the churchyard gate. The boy at the front, the fairest boy of the whole lot, was so fair he was practically white. He looked about 9 or 10 years old and wore a smart blazer, unlike the other orphans, whose clothes were too small and much poorer even than Ida's. Mrs. Buller strode ahead up West Street. The children scurried behind to keep up, but as soon as a thin girl with straggly brown hair and a trailing hem on her dress was through the gate, she stepped out of line to tie up her bootlace. Mutters and whispers came from the rest of the children. Mrs. Buller spun round. "Aggie!" called the fair boy at the front. But the matron barged past the children, yanked the thin girl up by her arm, and as good as threw her back in line. "Don't lag, you pointless specimen!" Ida waited for a tram to rattle past before she crossed the street, away from Mrs. Buller and the orphans. She pulled her cardie round her body, tried to put those poor children out of her mind, and ran home. Mum waved from the doorstep of their little terraced house in Camellia Lane, number 7. Her smile was as bright as ever. "I woke up and thought I'd just get a breath of fresh air and let the day indoors before you come home, love." Ida let Mum scoop her inside. Was it how Mum's hand trembled when she shook 2 aspirins from the new jar, or how quickly she swallowed them with one mouthful of water, or the way she flumped in her chair at the table when she had? Whichever it was, it made the cloud of worry that had settled round Ida's shoulders a little bit blacker. The October nip in the air soon became a November chill. The news on the wireless and in the papers was all about the king wanting to marry a divorced American lady. Mr. Rogers didn't approve of him being such friends with Mr. Hitler in Germany, but Ida wasn't sure that she approved of the royal goings-on at all, or she wouldn't if she had much space to think about them. Mum got worse, much worse. Aspirin, in spite of what people said about it being a wonder drug, hadn't done anything for Mum, and she was refusing to spend money on the doctor. "It'll be money down the drain, Ida. He won't be able to do anything that a couple of extra days' rest won't cure." Ida didn't believe that any more than Mum did. Mum also refused to see Uncle Arthur when he came back from his walking tour of Germany in November. It was hard to deter him after that, though. If Mum was having a rest upstairs, he'd insist on coming in to see. Page is stuck. He'd insist on coming in to see. "My little angel," he called her. He put coal in the bunker and bought presents for Bonnie. Ida couldn't understand Mum being so against him when he only wanted to help. He was Dad's friend, after all. In the end, Mum did give in to a visit from the doctor, who gave her a prescription for something stronger to take the pain away. "But all we can really do at this stage is keep her comfortable," he said, as he scribbled a prescription on the kitchen table and thrust it at Ida. "It's doubtful she'll see Christmas." His voice boomed through the house. "You'll have to make arrangements for your sister, you know. You're not old enough to care for her. You'd have to be at least 14 for that. No, Doctor, they must stay together, cried Mum from the bedroom. I can't bear to think of them apart. I'm nearly 14, pleaded Ida. Her 14th birthday was 6 days before Christmas. Though she hadn't been to school in weeks and she didn't want Mum to die ever, if Mum could only hold on until after the 19th of December, then Ida would officially be allowed to leave school to look after Bonnie, and Mum would have her wish. The doctor grunted. Go and calm your mother down. He put his hat on his head and without a glance backwards left through the front door. It was as if he'd sucked out all her insides, everything that made her Ida. She knew that these things happened, but not to Ida and Bonnie, not again. Everyone she'd known through school had at least one parent. Maybe she was lucky. Maybe that was because those that had none were in the Grange. The orphans didn't mix. She felt more than empty now, a dried-up husk of a girl who could be blown away to dust at any moment. She loved her mum so much, and more than anything didn't want her to die. Somehow, she'd have to persuade Mum to get the doctor's prescription. But if the worst came to the worst, and Mum really did die, the Grange was where they'd want to put Bonnie. How could she stop them?